The wind crawled across the empty plains, like an old spirit searching for something it had lost, carrying dust, silence, and the faint scent of storms yet to be born. And in the middle of that vast nothingness stood the lonely ranch of Elias Dorn, the young man whose life had become a slow-moving ache ever since the world had stripped him of family, laughter, and anything resembling warmth. He spent his days repairing fences, tending cattle, and speaking only to the moon when the nights were too quiet to bear, never imagining that fate would drag something extraordinary toward him the way lightning drags fire to the earth. It happened on a morning bright enough to blind the sorrow in his chest. Elias looked up from the corral and saw her approaching, a towering woman dressed in black, taller, broader, and stronger than any ranch hand he had ever known, her presence cutting through the desert heat like a shadow cast by a mountain. She moved with a steadiness that made the world seem small around her, her long dark hair whipping behind her, her eyes sharp enough to tame storms. And when she reached the fence, she looked at him as though she had known him for years, as though she had come not by chance, but by purpose older than the land itself. Her name was Mara, the widow of Black Mesa, spoken of in whispers across the territory. Some said she carried grief, like a second heart. Others swore she had once been strong enough to lift a fallen horse alone, and still others claimed she lived in exile after losing the only man she had ever loved. Elias had heard the rumors, but rumors meant nothing when confronted by the woman herself. She was not merely tall, she was giant-strong, giant-framed, giant-hearted in a way that made even the open desert feel narrow. She looked down at him, not with arrogance, but with a heaviness that suggested she was holding something fragile deep inside, and she said softly, "I need to speak with you." Her voice rumbled low, like distant thunder preparing to roll across the sky. Elias swallowed, suddenly aware of the vast difference between their statures, not just of body but of experience. She seemed carved from the earth itself, while he felt like dust struggling to stay whole in the wind. Mara stepped closer, her boots sinking into the sand, and he realized she was trembling. "I need someone," she murmured, and her eyes didn't shy away from his. "I need to feel alive again. Don't move." The words made Elias freeze, not out of fear, but out of a strange pull he couldn't name, something ancient and electric that seemed to rise from the ground beneath them. But before she could touch him, before she could say another word, the ranch gate suddenly slammed open with a violence that sent dust spiraling upward, an unexpected arrival that broke the moment like glass. A wagon rattled toward them, driven by two men whose faces were half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. But their intent was clear the instant they jumped down. Danger clung to them like oil, thick and dark. Elias felt Mara step slightly in front of him, a silent protective instinct that shocked him more than the strangers themselves. She was powerful, yes, but this was something else entirely. This was a widow ready to fight for someone she had met only seconds before. "We've been looking for you." "Mara?" one of the men said, his grin rotten and crooked, and Elias felt the air tighten. Mara didn't flinch. "You shouldn't have come here," she replied, her voice dropping to a tone that made even the horses stop their restless stomping. The men began to circle like coyotes, their hands drifting dangerously near their holsters, and Elias's heart hammered as he realized the truth. Mara hadn't come seeking comfort. She had come running from something that was still chasing her. But before fear could root in his bones, she turned her head just enough to speak to him without looking away from the danger. "Elias," she whispered, "whatever happens, trust me." And in that moment, something awakened inside him, not courage exactly, but a pull toward her, an instinct he did not know he possessed. What followed struck like lightning. Mara lunged with impossible speed, knocking the first man backward with a force that seemed far beyond human, as though her grief itself had become a weapon. The second man drew his gun, but Elias moved without thinking, slamming the gate shut and ramming a shovel into the man's arm, sending the pistol clattering to the dirt. The widow and the rancher, one a giant carved by tragedy, the other a lonely soul carved by silence, fought side by side until the men fled, limping and bloodied, swearing they would return with more. In the settling dust, Elias found himself breathing hard, standing beside Mara as though they had known each other all their lives. She looked at him then, not as a stranger, but as something far more unsettling and far more important. "You weren't supposed to help me," she said quietly. "But you did." Elias felt his throat tighten. "You said, 'Don't move.'" She stared at him for a long time, and the desert seemed to hold its breath around them. Then instead of anger or fear, she surprised him with something gentler, something almost like gratitude mixed with the fragile beginning of hope. "Then maybe," she said, "I wasn't wrong to come here after all." And just like that, the lonely ranch felt less empty, the wind less cold, the silence less painful. But trouble was riding toward them again. Trouble she had tried to outrun. Trouble he had unknowingly invited by. Standing at her side, and whatever happened next would bind their lives in ways neither could have predicted. As the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised gold and burning red, Mara placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle for someone of her strength. "This isn't over," she murmured. "But if you'll have me here, I will stand with you." And Elias, who had spent years believing he stood alone in the world, finally let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Stay," he whispered. "Just stay." And with the coming night, their story truly began, a story of danger, healing, strength, and the unexpected bond between a giant widow and a lonely rancher who shocked even himself with the courage he found in her presence. As shadows stretched across the land like long, reaching fingers, a sense of destiny settled over the ranch, whispering that everything from this moment forward would change, forever.